Good evening, and thanks for joining me for another edition of In Focus. Tonight, we're speaking with David Maybury, an Ottawa resident and data scientist. Now, David lives in downtown Ottawa and had a bird's eye view of the Freedom Convoy when it landed in our nation's capital in late January of this year. They literally camped out below my bedroom window, he said in a published piece he released back in February called A Night with the Untouchables. Now, his article has gone viral and has just circulated around the world. David, thanks for joining me this evening.
Well, thank you for having me, Melanie.
And let's start by talking a little bit about the article that you published in February and why you decided to do it.
Well, at first, I didn't think I was going to write anything. I went down just to talk to people who were on my street. This was on the Wednesday night, I think, when they first arrived. And after talking with everybody, I got a sense that it was very different than what was being portrayed in the media. First of all, there was no honking at night. I sleep above it, so I know precisely how loud it was at night. And it wasn't, in fact, quieter at night than it normally was in downtown Ottawa.
Where is your window view looking down on?
It's right on Kent Street. So Kent Street, where I am, is a few steps. I can see the Peace Tower very clearly from my condo, and I'm right above the Kent Street, which is just south of the Supreme Court. So I can see the Supreme Court from my bedroom window, and going up Kent Street goes right up to Wellington. So this is where the convoy is on Wellington Street in front of the Parliament buildings, but it also wrapped around, coming down Kent Street all the way past where I live, going further south all the way down to Somerset. So I had a really good view of where everybody was. So
they rolled in, and you kind of looked around and thought, well, yeah, like let's
yeah, I didn't really follow it that closely before people arrived, and once they arrived, I was of course loud during the day, but at night it was very different than what I was seeing in different news sources. So I thought I'd go down and talk to them, and then after talking to them, I came home. It was about midnight, and I decided I couldn't sleep. So I thought I should write about the stories on my little blog that I have, about the people I talked to, and what their experiences were like coming from all over the country. I talked that night from somebody from every province except PEI.
And you said in the article that you published, you said you found that most of what you knew to begin with was from reporters and columnists who wrote from distant vantage points somewhere in the media heartland of Canada. And they were sort of depicting all of these protesters descending on Ottawa as white supremacists, racists, hate mongers, pseudo-Trumpian grifters, and QAnon-style nutters. So when you went down there to walk amongst these people, did you feel unsafe to begin with? Like, did you feel there was any kind of threat around you?
No, it was really quiet, because in the evening everybody was in their cabs or in their trucks. But there were people that were out, maybe some of them having a cigarette, some of them talking to other people. And I just went in and introduced myself, and everybody was super friendly. In fact, it was very Canadian. They're quite apologetic. They go, "Oh, you must, the noise during the day, I'm sorry, it's so loud." That's what they said to me. So it was a very Canadian group of people. It was a very mixed group too. So for instance, there were lots of Indigenous people. I talked to an Indigenous man who was 100 meters outside my front door. I talked to him for 40 minutes. He told me why he was there. There were people of all different races that I talked to. I think probably the similar composition of what you would have found if you just grabbed a whole bag of Canadians at random. So I felt it was very different than what was being portrayed, and that's why I wrote what I wrote.
Well, and certainly considering, white supremacists don't typically consist of multinational.
Yeah, that's right.
You talk about many of the people in the article, and we will have a link through to the article for people to read for themselves. And this is really just a bird's eye view. This is your vantage point. This is your discussions, the people that you met, and you walked amongst them for hours one evening, talking to them. People from all over, you said. Cochrane, Ontario, someone from Sudbury, Ontario. You talked to other people from Alberta. And what were you hearing generally from the people you were talking to?
I think the biggest message is that we had a government that felt that was out of touch with them, that they feel like they don't get heard, and that the people need to know that they matter. And this is something that I think that we need to really get to grips with in Canada, is that there are all kinds of different people, different views. And I think that this country can accommodate all kinds of different people. It does. It has a great history of that. And talking to these people, they were there to remind us that there aren't second-class citizens in this country. And they felt like it was time for the government to hear that they had had enough.
Mm-hmm. So day in and day out, you were able to watch things unfold. You were able to watch the interactions with the convoy protesters. And I'm assuming that your vantage point also allowed you to witness some of the force that was used against the protesters in the last days of the Freedom Convoy. Do you recall anything?
Actually, where the force was used was up on Wellington Street, and there wasn't any force used on Kent, where I live. What was surprising is that, and again, I don't know how much of it was portrayed in the media, is that most of the convoy had cleared out by the very last hours, and the people on my street had mostly moved. That morning, I talked to people who were in front of my condo building. What they had done, there's a very old church that's right next to where I live, and they'd collected all the supplies that they didn't use, and they put it in front of the church before they left. And so what had happened is that they had largely cleared out from that area. The street was almost entirely clear by the time that Wellington Street was being cleared out.
Gotcha. And so all of these donations to the church and things left to the church again, it's strange to kind of to look at that and say, well, these were hate mongers.
It wasn't anything of the sort. There was no. I talked to people down there. They would not. They were organized in terms of block captains. They made sure that there was no garbage. I have video from my condo of them just sweeping the sidewalks every morning it snowed. They made sure that the entrances were passable for condos that were facing on Kent Street. Mm-hmm. So yes, it was, there was civil disobedience in the sense that they were parked downtown, but it wasn't this sort of free-for-all chaos either, right? The block captains made sure that, like I said, garbage was picked up, the streets were clean. It was all very grassroots, but at the same time, they did what they could to make sure that that they can get their message heard, but at the same time not making noise.
And so you're saying that through this entire time that they were sort of parked and actively protesting, there was no time that you felt in danger. You didn't feel that.
No. Yeah. No, not at all. In fact, what I felt downtown is that on Kent Street, when the lights go green, it becomes a bit of a thoroughfare for some people who like to gun the sports cars going down at sometimes at night, and that didn't happen. So it's actually, I think, a little bit safer.
Interesting. Yeah. And so I'm kind of looking over some of the comments, because now we're going to talk a little bit about your thoughts around the Emergencies Act inquiry. Again, bird's eye view, you were amongst this for the entire time. And so I think that your perspective matters. And clearly it was important because your publication that you put out, A Night with the Untouchables, did go viral. It did spread around the world. You were being contacted from all around the world to discuss what you were seeing, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it has over millions of views. It's it was. I couldn't keep up with moderation of the comments, so I shut the comments down not long after I published it, so that I could. It was impossible to keep up. There was just so much. I didn't think there'd be this much interest in it, to be honest. When I wrote it, I just felt like that evening I had to talk about what I saw, but I didn't think it would catch on like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, some of the notes from the Emergencies Act inquiry include comments from, David Villeneuve said at no point, so he was the Canadian Security Intelligence Agency, and he said that he believed that the Emergencies Act was indeed required There were other comments that there were several safety concerns. There were, in an effort to keep the public safe from the protesters. Based on what you saw, what are your thoughts on some of those comments?
I think that's inaccurate. I don't think that there was it was in danger or any such thing. I think it was peaceful. Of course, it was civil disobedience. They were parked on the streets in downtown city, downtown in Ottawa. Civil disobedience, there's a history of that in this country, to let the government at time to time know. Fortunately, we don't have to use civil disobedience in our democracy very often, but sometimes it's an important reminder that there are minorities in this country who matter, and we can't always ignore what the minority has, what's infecting the minorities in our country. So in this particular case, there's people who felt very strongly about the vaccine mandates, which were probably a minority of the country, felt that they had been pushed too far. And I understand why they would be down here to protest that. What was remarkable is how peaceful it was, and how, what I thought, a sense of camaraderie, that, like I said, they organized themselves in these block captains situations to prevent anything from getting out of control in terms of garbage. And they were, the whole thing did not turn into this sort of chaotic mess that sometimes you see it reported. At least where I was, I mean, there were parties that were happening down toward Wellington Street in front of the Parliament building. But where I live, in the residential area here on Kent Street, that's not what it was like.
And it is interesting to me too, because when I look at some of the coverage, even when all of the takedown was happening, and the law enforcement was coming and sort of pushing the protesters to bring an end to everything. When you look at some of the way the mainstream media reported on that, and then we hear, testimony from people like you. And I, at the time, was speaking with other Ottawa residents that were saying that the only violence that they actually witnessed through the entire presence of the protesters in Ottawa was when the authorities moved in on the protesters. And so it's kind of interesting, because for the average Canadian who really just relies on the mainstream media as their main information source, they're going to know no different.
Yeah, I felt, I mean, there was a couple of times where I was watching media report on different stances, and often they would interview other people in different parts of the country. So they would interview somebody in Manitoba, they would interview the views of somebody in Vancouver. That's fine. Having people's ideas, or other Canadians, about what they might think of the situation is fine. But what they also need to do is leave their condos in Toronto or wherever they were doing their podcast, wherever it was, their media takes. They should just come down here and talk to people. And if they had done that early on, I think it would have helped understand, or help the Canadian public understand, the full totality of what was going on. And this country has had, like I said in the past, we've had civil disobedience before. Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, or the On to Ottawa Trek 1935. These are situations of working class people who felt the government was not taking their concerns seriously, and that's, sometimes a reminder is important.
Yeah, you did include that as well when you were saying you noticed that there were no reporters from any of Canada's news agencies walking among the trucks to find out who these people are. So you decided to do that, and of course that's where A Night with the Untouchables kind of came from. Another comment here, Minister of Emergency Preparedness Bill Blair complimented law enforcement on the entirely professional, proportional, and measured way they removed Freedom Convoy protesters from the streets of Ottawa. What are your thoughts on that statement?
Yeah, I didn't see the actual final days where they removed the final protesters up on Wellington Street. First of all, the police were making sure to keep that area clear of other people coming down into the area. If you wanted to go there, it was going to be a bit difficult. But in terms of the overall police situation, when you have civil disobedience like this and you try to figure out how to handle it, I think the police overall, I mean, it seemed kind of a crazy situation for them. They didn't know how to handle what to do at all, so as far as I could tell. And resorting to when they let it get to the state that it did, to have to pull what they feel they had to do is pull these much more sharp measures. I think just I don't know. It looks to my honest eye looking at it, it looks like the police were being a whole security apparatus is being rather amateurish in the whole situation. Professional. We've had situations that have been very difficult in this country in the past, and it's really, really important to not have to go to these kinds of measures. Right? That includes dialogue, it includes discussion, it includes making sure people are heard, even if they don't get their way. Sometimes that's enough. And I felt that this was beyond really a security situation; it was a political one too, and there needed to be that kind of opportunity to make sure that people knew they were being heard. And it wasn't really just a security problem, in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed, and I think I've heard from many that that really it was dialogue that they were looking to have with their leaders and the leadership and the government in this
Right.
country.
And it doesn't mean you get your way. It just means that you know you've been heard, and sometimes that's enough to take the temperature down.
Right. Absolutely. And so, did you watch and follow along with some of the Emergencies Act inquiry?
I didn't watch it on television. I saw some of the clips or the takes on it, or some of the news reports on it, but I didn't watch it as it was happening.
Was there any testimony or anything that you heard of coming from the inquiry that you thought, that was very different from what I witnessed?
Well, the initial hardship situation, I thought, where they taught were residents and former mayoral candidate here in Ottawa was talking about how awful it was. I mean, I'm sure some people felt really put out by it, having these large trucks and people protesting downtown Ottawa for the length of time that it was. But in terms of of saying that it was violent, or that it was some kind of mob that was looking to create all kinds of chaos, that's just not what it was. Like, I do not believe that for a moment, not having lived among it, not having watched it.
Well, and at some level, there was talk about using even stronger force, such as bringing tanks in, or at least tanks were mentioned in some of the conversation. I mean, I think for the most part, many have agreed that that would have been an overreach. Or
yeah, I think this is, and I don't like how people position this as an unprecedented situation in Canada. It is not anything of the sort. There's lots precedent for this in Canada. We had that, like I mentioned, the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919. And I really think people should read up on that, because there's a lot of similarities in terms of the language the government was using. They called them seditionists. They had seditionist trials. The language that the Justice Minister at the time was very similar to the language that's being used today. And a lot of those people are celebrated in the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. So I think that I think when time passes and we look at what happened here in February of this year, I think we will see this in a much different light. That is far more nuanced, and it's very important to understand that sometimes civil disobedience in a democracy in a great country like ours is important to remind everyone that you can only go so far when we have minorities to accommodate.
Well, and having said that, being that Canada is a great country, do you feel that democracy has been compromised?
I don't. I think this country is phenomenal. I think it makes mistakes, but it learns from them. If we read our history, these kinds of events have happened before, and we've become better every time it happens. I think that will happen in this case too. It'll take time. It doesn't happen fast. Democracies are slow, they're incremental. But I think that we will be a better country for it in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yes, hindsight is definitely always 20/20 and very valuable. Now, based on your bird's eye view of the events that unfolded in Ottawa during the Freedom Convoy protests, what do you hope to see coming out of this inquiry?
Oh, what I think, my personal opinion is, I think the Emergencies Act was an overreach. And I think I would like it if when we recognize that. I don't know if that will happen. Again, I think the history will judge it very differently. That would be my hope for it. I think we should be very cautious using those kinds of powers. I think we should recognize, as I said before, that civil disobedience is a reminder sometimes. Right? If it becomes violent, it's a different issue. But nonviolent civil disobedience, to let people know that they've had enough, is sometimes a very important reminder of what kinds of actions we need to take, how we need to listen to people.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, you answered my final question for you, your opinion, whether the invocation of the Emergencies Act was necessary. So clearly your opinion is it was overreach.
Oh yeah, I think it was overreach for sure.
Yeah, and I've had conversations with quite a few people who have said things along the lines of, what recourse should people have, right? Like when locally you're not being heard, and then provincially you're not being heard, and then federally you're not being heard. I mean, there's this argument that these protesters shouldn't have done what they did. But in a situation where you are backed against the wall, which many of these people were, with the mandates and losing their livelihood and not being able to work and things like that, really.
Yeah, it's tough. It really is. I had a conversation with one lady who was, I said, in the long run, let's talk to her. She's very upset about the reason why she was there. She's very upset about the situation. She had been fired from her job, and she was in a situation where she had custody difficulties with her husband, and she wasn't vaccinated. And I told her this country it works in the long run. And she said something that was quite heartbreaking. She said to me that night, but it doesn't work for me. And that's the thing, what we sometimes have to understand is that when you bring that kind of hardship to people, that kind of suffering, whether you think they're kooky or weird or different, it doesn't matter. They're Canadian, and we need to find a way to not have people suffer under such circumstances.
Certainly. David Maybury, an Ottawa resident who published A Night with the Untouchables back in February, bird's eye view of the protests in Ottawa. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and speaking a little bit about why you put that publication out and your opinion on the Emergencies Act. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
The current Lethbridge feed grain prices are as follows. Cash barley's at $4.45, feed wheat's at $4.56, and corn's at $4.50 per metric ton. In the milling wheat markets, March Minneapolis futures lost 4 cents at $8.98, with local hard red spring bids for December movement at $11.40 per bushel. In the oil seeds, nearby canola futures are down $1.40 at $8.5760, with delivered values for December movement at $19.22 per bushel. In the pulse markets, nearby red lentils are holding at 33 cents a pound, and yellow peas are trading at $12.75 per bushel. In the cattle markets, February live cattle dropped $1.92 at $153.90 per 100 weight. For more information on grain marketing, call me at 403-394-1711. I'm Sean Smith at Marketplace Commodities, accurate real-time marketing information and pricing options.
Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. To become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny. You can become a Western Standard member for just $10 a month or $99